Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 22nd, where I wanted to put some closure on Persuasion by reviewing a few quotes from Persuasion. I also wanted us to begin Jane Eyre, and I wanted to talk about the rest of the semester as well. As you know, we've been falling a little bit behind schedule, and if you will look at the notes below this video, you'll see that in the third section I have our upcoming assignments. Paper number 1, I gave an extension for until this Thursday, which is the 24th at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email at ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And also I gave an extension for journal number 3, which happens to be about Jane Eyre, and that will be on the 29th, and that happens to be a Tuesday. So that'll give us enough time to put some closure onto Jane Eyre. And you can also see in the notes below in the 4th section the course outline, where I just wanted to draw your attention to how the rest of the semester will be proceeding now that we are getting close to the end. That basically on the 24th, which is a Thursday, we will finish Jane Eyre and we will begin Dickinson. And then on the 29th, we will finish Emily Dickinson and begin Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. On the 1st of July, which is a Thursday, we will finish Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. On July 6th, which happens to be a Tuesday, we will be discussing the novella The Awakening by Kate Chopin, ending the semester the way we began with the same author. And then finally on the 8th, and that is the very last day of the semester, that's a Thursday, that's when we will have the final exam and also when paper number 2 is going to be due. For the final, it's just going to be a series of essay questions, and you get to choose within those essay questions. And it's open book, open notes, so you can utilize things like your journals, class videos, so forth. So if you've been doing the reading and watching the class videos, it's basically just a way of synthesizing everything that we have talked about. In terms of paper number 2, it's going to be very similar to what you did with paper number 1. The distinction being that you would be working with one of the later set of readings over the course of the semester, which is why paper number 2 is due at the ending of the semester. The idea is that the learning goes on with paper number 1, and keep in mind that everybody has the option of rewriting paper number 1 for a higher grade if you so choose to do so. Once I've return paper number 1 to you, I just ask that you submit in the original with my comments along with your revision, and you do that by the ending of the semester, so that would be July 8th. And in terms of what we are going to be doing for Emily Dickinson, you might have noticed that there is no journal due for Emily Dickinson. I know that the readings have been pretty heavy, and by the time we get to Dickinson, once we put some closure onto Jane Eyre, I wanted us to have a little bit of breathing room. So what I'm going to do when we get to the Dickinson section is I'm going to show a biography about Emily Dickinson, which actually quotes quite a bit from many of her poems. It's one of the reasons why I like that particular biography. And then what I'm going to ask you to do for that day's attendance question is to select one of her poems. She wrote over 1,000. To select one of her poems. You don't need to understand it, but just talk a little bit about why you thought that that was a poem that you wanted to share with the class. And while there is no journal due for Emily Dickinson, certainly if you want to earn a little bit of extra credit, you could write up something for a little bit more formal and submit that in. But basically the Dickinson section of the semester is kind of where we catch our breath, and then we move forward to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and then finally The Awakening. So in terms of Persuasion, I wanted to draw your attention to just a few quotes. In my version of Persuasion on page 39, we've got Sir Eliot talking a little bit about some of the concerns that he happens to have about this rising middle class. And he says that in 2 points, the Navy is of great objection to him. First, as being the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, and raising men to honors which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamt of. And secondly, as it cuts up a man's youth and vigor most horribly. A sailor grows old sooner than any other man. I've observed it all my life. Of course, Sir Eliot being the pompous, arrogant individual that he is so concerned with appearances. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important for him to rent out Kelnich Hall to somebody that he feels is suitable but yet not superior to him. So in that respect, the Navy would be just fine. But you can see how he is beginning to have concerns that the old caste system that he's become quite accustomed to is basically giving way to a system that rewards merit, not necessarily birthright. I wanted to also draw your attention to a quote, again in my version on page 41, where Mrs. Clay is talking about her perspective about individuals who work. And she says, in fact, as long as I have long been convinced, though every profession is necessary and honorable in its turn, it's only the lot of those who are not obliged to follow any, who can live in a regular way, in the country, choosing their own hours, following their own pursuits, and living on their own property, without the torment of trying for more. It is only their lot, I say, to hold the blessings of health and good appearance to the utmost. And of course, we see many similar qualities with Mrs. Clay and Walter Elliot and their concern with appearances, and how I think it's quite telling that she thinks that living in a regular way means that one doesn't necessarily have responsibilities. And of course we'll see that be very different when we get to Jane Eyre, when we are going to be reading about the life of a governess, and definitely in incidents in the life of a slave girl, when we read about Harriet Jacobs under the pseudonym of Linda Brent, and about how ultimately the hardships that she endured, not just as a slave, but a female slave. That's what makes that narrative so unusual. So on page 59, it's just a short little quote, and this is where Anne is speaking with Mary, and Anne is talking a little bit about how she's been making preparations for the family's move. And Mary's response is, well, basically Anne was saying how busy she was, and Mary's response is, dear me, what could you possibly have to do? This is on page 59. And that says a great deal about how little respect Mary has, but for Anne. But this is Anne's response. A great many things, I assure you, more than I can recollect in a moment, but I can tell you some. I've been making a duplicate of the catalog of my father's books and pictures. I have been several times in the garden with Mackenzie, trying to understand and make him understand which of Elizabeth's plants are for Lady Russell. And I have all my own little concerns to arrange, books and music to divide, and trunks to pack and repack, and so forth. And notice how she refers to herself, all of her own little concerns. And basically what we see in Persuasion is the development of Anne into a much more realized and independent human being. This is definitely a society of convention, and this we will see in Jane Eyre as well. But on page 60, again, a very small point, but this is when Anne and Mary are speaking, and they're talking a little bit about, or Mary is talking a little bit about, I suppose you will not like to call it the great house before they have been to see you. In other words, the proper decorum is that they should come first. And Anne's response, I have not the smallest objection on that account. I should never think of standing on such ceremony with people I know so well. And then, when eventually they do go to the great house, they sit the full half hour. And basically, that's the amount of time that one is expected to socialize in that kind of situation. We learn about the Musgroves, that they were friendly and hospitable, not much educated, not at all elegant, is on page 61 for me. Their children had more modern minds and manners. They were a numerous family, but the only two grown up, excepting Charles, were Henrietta and Louisa, young ladies of 19 and 20, who brought from a school at Exeter all the usual stock of accomplishments, and were now, like thousands of other young ladies, living to be fashionable, happy, and merry. And of course, we see how empty that life is from Anne's perspective, particularly because she oftentimes comments on the idea of how individuals are keeping busy. It's one of the things that she tends to admire. And one thing that perhaps sets Mary apart, as much as she is a follower of social convention, her feelings about being a mother. And we know from the Cult of True Womanhood the idea that a mother's responsibility would be the caretaking of the children. And on page 76, this is where ultimately one of her children happens to be slightly injured, and she says, "It's because I'm the poor mother, I'm not going to be allowed to stir," because she's upset that she can't go see this new gentleman who's come visiting, and happens to be Wentworth. "And yet I'm sure I'm more unfit than anybody else to be about the child. My being the mother is the very reason why my feelings should not be tried. I am not at all equal to it. You saw how hysterical I was yesterday." And she talks a little bit also that if his papa can go and visit this new individual, then why can't she? So in some ways, this is a rather surprising comment from Mary. We do know that she's selfish and self-centered, but there's almost a little bit of a feminist in here. On page 89, this is when Frederick Wentworth is speaking with his sister and talking a little bit about how ultimately women can't be comfortable on board a ship. And his sister basically tells him, "Well, you're being quite sexist. I cannot believe it of you. All idle refinement. Women may be as comfortable on board as in the best house in England. I believe I've lived on board, as much on board as most women, and I know nothing superior to the accommodations of man of war." And her objection that life for women should not just be idle refinement. So we know that on page 96, Mary is talking a little bit about the idea that perhaps Louisa or Henrietta might end up marrying the wrong person. And from her perspective, she says, "I don't think any young woman has the right to make a choice that might be disagreeable and inconvenient to the principal part of her family." And of course, this is something that ultimately led to Anne rejecting Wentworth, and that leads to our love story with the happy ending. And Mary continues on that it would be shocking to see, for instance, Henrietta marry Charles Hayter. It would be a very bad thing for her, and still worse for me. And again, we see right at the very beginning of the novel how important familial and social connections are, with Sir Walter looking at the listing of his family. So we learn a little bit too on page 119 about Captain Benwick. Harville's he was engaged to Harville's sister, and she died, and that he had a melancholy air about him, just as he ought to have had. And again, the idea of what is the correct appearance for somebody who is supposed to be grieving. And then Anne's commentary about Captain Harville. While he was no reader, he had contrived excellent accommodations and fashioned very pretty shelves for a tolerable collection of well-bound volumes, the property of Captain Benwick. His lameness prevented him from taking much exercise, but a mind of usefulness and ingenuity seemed to furnish him with constant employment within. He drew, he varnished, he carpented, he glued, he made toys for the children, he fashioned new netting needles with pins and improvements. If everything else was done, he sat down to his large fishing net. Again, the importance of staying busy. We see something very similar when Anne is visiting Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Smith is talking about these little pin cushion cases that she's making because she wants to have a sense of being useful, and she's also trying to earn a little bit of money, and that also is a way that female can get a bit of autonomy and independence. Certainly we know that Mrs. Smith is in such a state that she needs to have a male act in her regard, which is what Wentworth does, and that's how ultimately we have the happy ending. And as we continue on, talking a little bit about these characters, Mrs. Smith in particular, as I was saying, on page 180, was making these little thread cases, pin cushions, and card racks, busy about supplying me with the means of doing a little good to one or two of the very poor families in the neighborhood. And at least in my version, in the introduction, it talks about how it would have been nice if we could have explored that a little bit more, the idea of female agency. But We do know that this book is very different from Frankenstein because we have a central female character who states, and this is towards the ending of the book, on page 263, some rather feminist perspectives about the differences between men and women. And Anne basically says, your feelings may be the strongest, and she's talking about males, but the spirit of analogy will authorize me to assert that ours, women's, are the most tender. Man is more robust than woman, but he is not longer lived, and which exactly explains my view of the nature of their attachments. Nay, it would be too hard upon you if it were otherwise. You have difficulties and privations and dangers enough to struggle with. You're always laboring and toiling, exposed to every risk and hardship. Your home, country, friends, all quitted. Neither time, nor health, nor life to be called your own. It would be too hard indeed if a woman's feelings were to be added to all of this. And then she continues on where she talks about that men have had every advantage to women in telling their own story. Education has been theirs to a much higher degree. The pen has been in their hands. And of course, that's probably the author herself making a statement about how ultimately she's violating that expectation by penning this particular book. And then we go on, and Captain Harville is talking about the difficulties involved about having to leave a woman. And Anne responds, God forbid I should undervalue the warm and faithful feelings of any of my fellow creatures. I should deserve utter contempt if I dared to suppose that true attachment and constancy were known only by woman. No, I believe men, you, are capable of everything great and good in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion, to every domestic forbearance, as long, if I might be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives, and lives for you. All the privilege I claim for my own sex, is not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of loving the longest, when existence or when hope is gone. Now, this is certainly a much stronger commentary than anything that we saw in Frankenstein, but Jane Eyre is going to really give us the opportunity to see commentary. And we also are going to get a Gothic romance. And if you remember, I talked a little bit about Frankenstein and how ultimately it followed the Gothic tradition in terms of the setting being dark and gloomy, and that there are possibilities of supernatural elements. And we see that in Thornfield. And in fact, what you could even think of in many respects is that this large book is really 5 separate books, or that's really the way that I think of it. That the first 4 chapters is sort of one tale in and of itself about Gateshead. The second section, chapters 5 to 10, happen to be about Lowood, the boarding school. The third section, chapters 11 to 27, that happens to be about Thornfield. That's where we get many of the Gothic elements, though we get a few of them also in the first 4 chapters. And then we've got Morehouse, Marsh End, chapters 28 to 35, and Ferndean, and that's chapters 26 to 38. And we've got lots of social and religious commentary. This was written under a pseudonym, Carter Bell. And at least in the introduction that I have in my version, there was a reviewer, Elizabeth Rigby, from the Quarterly Review, and said that Jane Eyre's author should be blamed for the highest moral offense a novel writer can commit, that of making an unworthy character interesting. The book was said to be mischievous and vulgar, pandering to the public taste for illegitimate romance. And think about how we began the semester and we talked about the dangers of novels. Now, of course, Jane Eyre is a term when you might be familiar with the plain Jane, who is the poor orphan, and this is basically a coming-of-age novel. She's older and she's reflecting back upon her youth. And unlike Anne Elliot, who is an observer, Jane is definitely an active participant. And in fact, another reviewer said, Erica Young, Jane may be the first heroine in fiction to know that she needs her own identity more than she needs marriage. Her determination not to relinquish selfhood for love could well belong to a contemporary heroine. And in fact, there was even some debate that this Currer Bell couldn't have been a woman, because ultimately it was impossible for a woman to have been able to write in this particular fashion. But of course, we know that's exactly what happened with the famous Bronte, Charlotte Bronte of the famous Bronte sisters. And in her preface, Charlotte Bronte writes, "Conventionality is not morality, and self-righteousness is not religion." And that's something that we're going to actually be seeing, be seeing within the book itself, as we have our character development. Now, as I indicated, this is a very long book, and what I've done is I have included a BBC adaptation in the event that you wanted to watch the film version. That said, this is in no way a substitute for reading the text, but if it will help you with reading the longest text of the semester, certainly you are free to watch it. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, they're known basically for doing very good adaptations of pieces of literature. So again, you don't have to watch this adaptation, but you'll see that in the notes below I have included that if you wanted to watch it. I think it's not a bad adaptation. There really is no way to do Jane Eyre in its entirety just because of its length. So usually you've got a good amount of cutting. Most adaptations really focus on the Thornfield section. This happens to be the romance between Jane and Mr. Rochester. But that's not to say that the other sections aren't equally as important. And we're first introduced to that first section, Gateshead, in chapter 1. It's very aptly named. Charlotte Bronte is very careful about her names. They have particular significance. So when we think about Gateshead, the idea of a gate can represent entrapment, but a gate can also be opened as well as closed. And basically, we get this sense of entrapment right at the very beginning when we're told that there was no possibility of a walk that day. And we just finished reading Persuasion and the importance of being able to take a walk, because you're going to be able to see new people and new environments. And Jane is there as a young girl sitting cross-legged reading on a dreary November day. Dreary November day is very gothic, but the idea that she's sitting cross-legged, very unladylike, so already as a child she's defying the expectations for female. And of course we see how in some ways this is kind of like a fairy tale with your wicked stepmother and stepsisters or step siblings. And basically what we find out is that Jane is the poor relation who basically has been taken in by her Aunt Reed. Again, the name is very important, Reed. The idea of a reed is something that doesn't have much of a life force. It's very thin and brittle, and that's very much like her aunt's character. And Jane basically gets into a bit of an altercation with one of her cousins, and while he is responsible, John Reed, Jane is the one who's punished, which is pretty typical for the situation that she's in. And we find out in chapter 2 that Jane resisted punishment, which was a new thing for me. So this is a 10-year-old Jane. And again, we have the adult Jane reflecting back on her life as a 10-year-old Jane when she's taken to the Red Room, and that room seems to have many of the Gothic elements that we talk about, and that Jane is convinced that she sees a ghost or some sort of supernatural apparition. It's probably a figment of her imagination, but this also is some foreshadowing and preparation for some of the eerie events that are going to occur later on in the novel. In chapter 3, we have an adult Jane who basically is making a reflection that I ought to forgive Mrs. Reed. But child Jane does not, I ought to forgive Mrs. Reed. But of course, that is an adult looking back on her past. And also, when Jane is asked if she wanted to go someplace else and be with poor people, Jane does not want to belong to poor people, saying, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste. So we get the backstory for Jane is that her birth mother married a poor clergyman and was basically disinherited because it was a bad match. Again, think about the importance of marriage, as we saw in Persuasion. Jane's parents ended up dying, and then her mother's brother, Mr. Reed, took in Jane, was particularly fond of her. One of the reasons why Mrs. Reed is not fond of Jane. So after Mr. Reed died, Mrs. Reed, again, that stiff and brittle sort of individual, grudgingly raises Jane, while Mrs. Reed ends up spoiling her own children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana, which we are going to see later on in the novel as adults. And then in chapter 4, it's basically Jane is going to be sent to school, and we find out that the headmaster, his name is Mr. Brocklehurst. He's described as a kind of black pillar, and he is rigid and hypocritical, and that's a commentary on the rigid and hypocritical not only educational system, but also of boarding schools, but also the rigid and hypocritical nature of religion as well. And Jane, we see how feisty she is. She tells Brocklehurst that she will avoid hell. When he asks, well, how are you going to avoid hell? What she's supposed to say is be a good person. And basically what Jane says is that, well, I just can't die now, can I? So she's pretty sassy, not just for a female, but for a child as well. And she tells Mrs. Reed to her face, her aunt, that she is bad, hard-hearted, and deceitful. Again, think about the bravery of a child to be able to speak to an adult like that, let alone a female. So that would be what I call the first section of the book, and that's the that's the Gateshead section. And then we move to the Lowood section. This happens to be the boarding school. Again, this is Bronte's opportunity to make commentary, social commentary on some of the poor conditions of boarding schools during her time. This begins with chapter 5, and Lowood. When you think about the idea of being low or poor, and also the conditions are pretty low. The boarding school has many deprivations, and one of the happy or shining lights of the school, though, happens to be a Miss Temple. Again, very aptly named because she serves as a kind of temple, a place of sanctuary and safety for Jane. And this is also where Jane makes a friend, Helen Burns. And you can say that Helen burns an impression on Jane. The idea of burning an impression. Again, the name's very, very important here. In chapter 8, this is where a young Jane is saying, if others don't love me, I'd rather die than live. I cannot bear to be solitary. And of course, we'll see how ultimately Jane progresses over the course of her life. So she's going to understand that she is going to have to basically be solitary. And one of the things that happens to Jane is that she understands her own self-worth is more important than relationship. And in some ways, that's a very modern kind of ideology, even for today's world, especially during the time in which this particular text was written. Now in chapter 9, Helen dies of tuberculosis, and one could say that one of the reasons why Helen dies is because she's too focused on the afterlife to live. She's concerned with the hereafter, while Jane is very much concerned with the present and with living life. And Jane also talks about in chapter 9 the healing power of nature for her, as many are dying of tuberculosis, and the children are basically out of the boarding school at this point. And Jane reflects that this world is pleasant. It would be dreary to be called from it. Again, keep this in mind when we have an adult Jane who is going through who will be going through great deprivations. In chapter 10, we find out how, because of all of those deaths, improvements are made to Lowood, and Jane finds, quote, a new servitude, unquote, by boldly advertising for employment as a governess. And again, think about how bold this is for Jane. Jane is there, now she's graduated, she's working in the boarding school, but by this point, Miss Temple has left because Miss Temple is now gone to be married, and of course, a married woman cannot retain her professional status. So that basically Jane realizes that without Miss Temple there, she's lost much of the excitement with staying at Lowood, and she decides that she wants a new servitude, and she boldly advertises for employment. as a governess. Again, Jane is a very active character, and Jane is a very strong character. And this is where we move to Thornfield. And think about the idea of a field and all of the positives associated with the field, a wide expansiveness, greenery, and so forth. But that's also coupled with the idea of a thorn, which can also be very negative. A thorn can be something that can hurt, that can prick, that can cause pain, and Jane's going to experience both pain and pleasure in Thornfield. She meets the housekeeper, which happens to be Mrs. Fairfax. The others are only servants, and Mrs. Fairfax says, and one can't converse with them on terms of equality. So we're beginning to see that kind of social rigid structure that we saw in Persuasion as well. Jane's charge is to watch Adele Varennes, so that's Jane's pupil, and basically that's a ward of Mr. Rochester, who happens to be the master of Thornfield Estate. Perhaps it's Rochester's illegitimate child abandoned by her mother, or perhaps it isn't necessarily Rochester's biological child, but he's taken responsibility for Adele. And keep that in mind as well about Rochester wanting to take responsibility for things. And this is where we begin to hear strange ghost-like laughs, and we begin to be told about these dark, eerie passages, again, very gothic. In chapter 12, Jane makes some commentary. Human beings must have action. It's saying that women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation. It is narrow-minded to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. In some ways, it's somewhat similar to what Anne Elliot was saying in Persuasion, but this is much bolder and much more direct. So, in chapter 12, while Jane is out mailing a letter, and again, think about the importance of taking a walk and leaving one's environment. In fact, the home oftentimes was seen as a kind of place of confinement or even imprisonment for female. She's posting a letter for Mrs. Fairfax. Jane helps the stranger, who turns out to be Mr. Rochester, and he's 20 years Jane's a senior. He's fallen off his horse, and Jane is pleased to have done something at this point. She says an active thing. And of course she describes Rochester as masculine, dark, strong, and stern. You don't have to use a lot of imagination to kind of figure out that we are going to begin to get a romance here, even though Jane is just a lowly governess, and also Jane is quite plain. But we will see that as Jane's prospects improve, her physicality also improves. You could even say that she begins to regain some bloom, if we wanted to use some language from Persuasion there. So basically, as we continue on in chapter 13, Jane has shown strength and independence to Rochester. And we find out that Rochester inherited Thornfield after his older brother died. And there's some intrigue involved with that, but that is not going to be revealed to us, because this is as much a mystery story as it is a romance, and as it is a Gothic story, and also social commentary. So there are a lot of different genres that are mixed into this tale to appeal to a lot of different audience members. So Rochester in chapter 14 asks Jane if he is handsome, and Jane says the truth. No. Again, this is the saucy, audacious Jane that, as a little girl, basically is able to tell off her aunt. And of course, Rochester is used to everyone basically complimenting him because of his status and wealth. So this is quite unusual. And then Rochester asks Jane to speak, and consequently, she remains silent, eventually stating that nothing freeborn would submit to insolence, even for a salary. So again, we see a lot of boldness in this particular character. In chapter 15 is when Rochester's bed is set on fire, possibly by some servant by the name of Grace Poole, who might be responsible for this ghostly laugh. And Jane assists Rochester, and we see how they're becoming closer. And then, in chapter 16, Rochester brings his beautiful, vain, arrogant girlfriend, Miss Blanche Ingram, and friends to Thornfield, and demanding that Jane keep in their company, even though he knows that this is paining Jane, because he's quite aware that Jane has some attraction to him. And basically, at this point, Jane has secretly fallen in love with him. And also says she doesn't condemn him for marrying or for wanting to marry, only for connection. that seemed to be something that was typical of his class. So she's not too surprised that he would be interested in Miss Ingram because of her wealth and her beauty. But one of the things that Jane observes is that in terms of character and personality, Miss Ingram is quite lacking. And then in chapter 18, we get this mysterious stranger. Mr. Mason mysteriously arrives from Jamaica. So I thought I'd end here. I don't want to give too much away of the plot if you haven't gotten to it yet. And again, if you wanted to watch the movie production, or the BBC production, I should say, of this particular version of Jane Eyre, I've included that for your perusal. But what I will do is that I will finish up talking about Jane Eyre next class. Keep in mind that next class is also when paper number 1 is going to be due via PDF to my email at ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. So, in terms of today's attendance question, I thought I might ask you about Jane Eyre. Thus far, based on your reading, do you like or dislike this novel, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I am doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.